How to avoid letting your expectations and aspirations depress you. Now, I think you can tell quite a bit about someone's state of mind by how they imagine their future will be. The fact is, of course, that any expectation about the future has to be imaginative, because we can never fully know what will or won't happen. We might hope and dream of and fully expect a happy retirement, a fun-packed trip abroad, an exciting romance, or a happy and socially wonderful time when we arrive at university. Because we have the resources, these might be both hopes and solid expectations. When we're optimistic, we expect things to turn out well. When we're pessimistic, we expect things to be worse. And sometimes we're right either way. It may be that the optimism or pessimism itself shapes how events actually turn out. After all, if you're optimistic, if your expectations are high, then you don't tend to give up so easily. And you may continue to find a way of bringing your positive expectations into reality. So learning how people in your life relate to the future, whether they take it as it comes or have high, low, or in between expectations, can tell you a lot about them. Expectations matter, as evidenced by the huge role of placebo in physical and emotional healing and its evil twin, nocebo, negative expectation in making us sicker. It's easy to assume that expectations are the same as aspirations, but they are not necessarily the same thing at all. We're made to aspire to live in a big house or to be a celebrity, yet expect a life of relative poverty and anonymity. In this case, you can see there's a big gap between the aspiration and the expectation, and the size of that gap might have a lot to do with susceptibility to depression. Our aspirations may tally with the expectations, but if they don't, we may, according to research, be more likely to become depressed. Our aspirations and expectations are in part shaped by the culture around us. If a society highly values marriage and agricultural work and doesn't particularly espouse celebrity or wealth, people may both aspire to and expect to work on the land and to get married when they come of age. In societies that engender extreme aspirations, perhaps relating to universal adoration or great wealth, there can be a huge gulf between the aspirations we're conditioned towards and our actual expectations. And this gulf can leave us feeling empty and unfulfilled. We might aspire to these kinds of lives while simultaneously expecting nothing of the kind. We are, in a sense, torn. Research published back in 2015 found some interesting patterns in school-age depression as it relates to the widening divide between aspiration and expectation. The study, entitled "When Aspirations Exceed Expectations, Quixotic Hope Increases Depression Among Students," found an apparent paradox in modern schooling that students are simultaneously more positive about the future, yet more depressed than ever. This does seem weird. Why should students who are more positive about the future be more depressed? The researchers suggest that it may not be a paradox at all. In fact, the two states may be causally linked. Two studies have demonstrated that students are more likely to be depressed when their educational aspirations exceed their actual expectations. In the first study, students who aspired to higher grades than they actually expected to achieve were more likely to be depressed at both the beginning and the end of the academic year. Similarly, in the second study, students who aspired to attain a certain level of education, for example to attend college or to gain a particular degree, but did not actually expect to attain it, were more likely to be depressed both at the time of the study and 5 years later. On the other hand, For students who didn't care so much about future academic attainment, the expectation of not doing well didn't predict depression. Both studies suggest that when a student's aspiration falls a long way off from their expectation, they are at greater risk of becoming depressed. If this is true, it tells us something really important about both aspiration and expectation. Aspirations that are far removed from expectations are depressing because they take away our sense of personal control, and a sense of diminished control is inherently depressing. On the other hand, when our aspirations match up with our expectations, they remain connected to a sense of personal autonomy, which is empowering. As the researchers said, these findings highlight the danger of teaching students to aspire higher without also investing time and money to ensure that students can reasonably expect to achieve their educational goals. Could it be that in many schools we teach kids to dream big, aim high, and shoot for the stars, but focus less on teaching them to develop the resources they need to plan effectively and work towards their goals? Unfortunately, a number of barriers continue to prevent many students from realizing their aspirations, and this increasingly positive view of the future contrasts with the darker reality. Depression is on the rise in schools. Roughly a third of college students report feeling depressed in America, and this figure, already substantially higher than in the general population, appears to be on the rise. So, educational aspirations that rise beyond realistic expectations are associated with greater depression now and in the future. But what about in the population at large? Beyond education, the same may hold true. I'm certainly not suggesting that all depression is caused by the widening gap between aspiration and expectation. I'm simply saying this divide may be a contributing factor in the rising rates of depression in people of all age groups, not just students. Aspirations need to be aligned to a sense of self-efficacy. We need to work towards goals for their own sake, rather than, for example, wanting to be famous but not really knowing why. So ask yourself to what extent your aspirations are removed from your expectations. Now think about how much self-efficacy you have in this regard. To what extent can you work toward making your aspiration into an expected reality? Really think about what is and isn't under your control. For example, I can aspire to run a marathon and for everyone to tell me afterwards how wonderful I was. At this point, running the marathon is just an aspiration. It only becomes an expectation when I actually register my name for the marathon. By running shoes, start running regularly, and have a proper plan in place. At this point, I've done what I can do as my self-efficacy is taken care of. I don't need the marathon to be merely an aspiration anymore because it's become an expectation. The aspiration part can fade away as it's no longer needed. I'm getting ready for my marathon, and I know when it's going to happen. Now the other part of my aspiration was for everyone to tell me how wonderful I was for running the marathon. Was this part of the aspiration based on me and what I can do? Or was it less under my control? Is it a valid expectation or just some woolly aspiration? If it's the latter, perhaps I can temper my aspiration in that regard. Just as the desire to be universally loved is a dangerous and woefully unrealistic aspiration that some people do have, so too, simply expecting everyone to tell me how great I am after running 26 miles may be a tad unrealistic. I can realistically expect some people to be really impressed, others to be somewhat impressed, still others to be polite and try to show an interest, and a few to show no interest or sense of being impressed at all. That's how people are, and that's fine by me. Or I can simply focus on what I want to do and be less concerned with what others think or don't think. The point is, as soon as fantasy starts creating illusions of universal approval, we need to remember what people are actually like in the way they respond to us. Reactions are as diverse as people. This allows us to form a more balanced expectation rather than a totally out of touch with reality aspiration. So, expectations should be aligned to what you do and want, rather than getting too mixed up with what other people will do and say when you get whatever it is you want. None of this is to say that we shouldn't dream big or have mighty goals. I'm simply talking about ways to stop aspirations from depressing us by becoming too untethered from expectation. The more constructive and practical we become, the more the gap between aspiration and expectation satisfyingly closes. Some time spent in a delightful fantasy world of achievement and popularity may be okay, but ultimately we need to forget that and get on with shaping our lives so that we can be fueled by realistic expectations rather than flimsy aspirations. So, the takeaways from this are: firstly, work out how big the gap is between your aspirations and your expectations, and consider whether the size of the gap may have been depressing you. Secondly, disentangle your aspirations from your expectations. Then work to increase your self-efficacy so that you can bring your aspirations and expectations closer together. And finally, drop the parts of your aspirations that are beyond your control, such as what others will think of you or how they will react to your success. And lastly, examine where your aspirations come from and therefore whether you really want them or need them at all. After all, just because we're taught we should want certain things from life doesn't mean it's right for us. I hope you found this interesting and useful.